What's that? Adrian thinks that the sort of commonplace talking points surrounding a poem are woefully underthought, undercooked, and underserved? It can't be. But it is. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for another poetry discussion, which will appear, of course, in the poetry discussion playlist, now over 600 videos strong. The poem in question today is The Fish by Elizabeth Bishop. I will read the poem, tell you what the talking points are around the poem, and kind of explain why I think that is silly. The Fish reads as such. I caught a tremendous fish. I caught a tremendous fish and held him beside the boat, half out of water, with my hook fast in the corner of his mouth. He didn't fight. He hadn't fought at all. He hung a grunting weight, battered and venerable and homely. Here and there his brown skin hung in strips, like ancient wallpaper, and its pattern of darker brown was like wallpaper. Shapes like full-blown roses, stained and lost through age. He was speckled with barnacles, fine rosettes of lime, and infested with tiny white sea lice. And underneath 2 or 3 rags of green weed hung down, while his gills were breathing in the terrible oxygen. The frightening gills, fresh and crisp with blood that can cut so badly. I thought of the coarse white flesh packed in like feathers, the big bones and the little bones, the dramatic reds and blacks of the shiny entrails, and the pink swim bladder like a big peony. I looked into his eyes, which were far larger than mine, but shallower and yellowed, the irises backed and packed with tarnished tinfoil seen through the lenses of old, scratched isinglass. They shifted a little, but not to return my stare. It was more like the tipping of an object toward the light. I admired his sullen face, the mechanism of his jaw, and then I saw that from his lower lip, if you could call it a lip, grim, wet, and weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line, or 4 and a wire leader, with the swivel still attached, with all their 5 big hooks grown firmly in his mouth, a green line frayed at the end where he broke it, 2 heavier lines, and a fine black thread still crimped from the strain and snap when it broke and he got away. Like medals with their ribbons frayed and wavering, a 5-haired beard of wisdom trailing from his aching jaw, I stared and stared, and victory filled up the little rented boat from the pool of bilge where oil had spread a rainbow around the rusted engine, to the bailer rusted orange, the sun-cracked thwarts, the oarlocks on their strings, the gunnels, until everything was a rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. And I let the fish go. So, what are the normal talking points about this poem that you kind of find generally around the internet, and why do I think that's wrong? The general talking points about this poem, and I'm not making this up, seem to, and I was never taught this poem in college, so maybe I am just frequenting shallow poetry websites when I try to see, hey, do I have anything to contribute to this discussion? Or do I just need to say, this is what people say? The general talking points about this poem seem to be the fisher here catches a fish, sees it in its rough state, grows compassionate for that fish, and lets it go. That's not an interpretation. That's literally what happens. That's literally what happens. So that's not what the poem is about. That's what the poem's about. There is, what's the poem about? And what's the poem about? The poem's about the fisherman catching a fish, becoming sympathetic for it because it's been through so much, and throwing it back. What it's actually about, in my opinion, look, if you are to accept the argument that a poem, most poems, doesn't have to be, most poems are a metaphor of some sort. And here's the thing, even if a poem is not a metaphor, if you find one of these spectacular poems that is not metaphorical, if you can read the metaphor into it, it's metaphorical. Once the poem leaves the author's pen, it no longer belongs to them. They do not get to say what it is about. So maybe Elizabeth Bishop wrote this poem about the compassion of fishermen. Maybe. Okay. I'm willing to go with it, man. Yeah, far out. However, if you ask me, what's really going on in this poem? At the base level, what we can kind of assume that every poem is about, if we want to, what we can really, the place we can really take all literature is the self. All we can know is the self. All we've ever known is the self. So William Faulkner, one of my favorite writers of characters. Boy, does he put some wild ones on the page. He couldn't write them down there if he didn't understand them, if part of that person were not in him. If Anse Bundren were not part of his own ethos on some base level, he would not be such a convincing character. If we're allowing that all poems really are about the self on some level, what is that fish a symbol of, if not the self? What is that fish a symbol of, if not finding compassion for the self? All of these ugly parts of that fish. And this fisher person, I don't think is gendered ever. I think we're left to assume masculine just because it's fishing, right? This person who catches the fish looks at this war-torn, old thudder of a fish, hooks in his mouth, gills kind of don't work, skin's all tore up, covered with barnacles, sapping the life out of it bit by bit. The speaker looks at that ugly fish, or, the speaker looks at that ugly fish, however you want to do this. The speaker looks at that ugly fish and decides, by God, that's me. I've got those hooks in my jaw. I have those problems breathing the terrible oxygen. The moment that I'm actually caught by life, I don't even really have the will to fight anymore. I mean, go ahead, put your finger in my mouth and I'll bite it off. But if I'm just coasting by the side of the boat, I don't have the will to win any longer. That, in my opinion, is what's going on in this poem. And really, finding the compassion for the self because, you've been through a whole lot. And probably life didn't turn out the way you wanted it. And you do have those barnacles built up. And you do have a couple of hooks in your lip. Finding that compassion for the self in that way, is the way that someone finds compassion for others. So I think that is what is at the bottom of this poem. That is all I have for this poetry discussion. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, there's literature on the channel several times a week. There's poetry every Monday, and I hope to have you back for the next one.